Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really significant piece of work, the chapter on Autism Spectrum Disorders from Kaplan and Sadock's 11th edition. It's dense stuff. Our goal here is to, well, cut through that density. We want to pull out the core ideas, the history, those big DSM-IV shifts, and what we know now about the neurobiology and treatment of ASD. Think of this as your focused guide.
Absolutely. And the chapter really hammers home this theme of complexity and constant change. The story here is about evolution, how we went from Leo Kanner's 1943 description of a very specific rare condition to today's idea of a broad spectrum. Diagnosis has had to adapt,
Okay, let's start right there with the biggest recent adaptation, that shift from DSM-IV to DSM-V. Clinically, this was huge. We had that old triad, social, communication, repetitive behaviors. What replaced it?
Right. So the DSM-5 aimed to streamline things. It basically collapsed that triad into two core domains. First, you got deficits in social communication and social interaction. That's one bucket.
Okay.
Second is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And importantly, this second domain now specifically includes sensory issues, things like being over or underreactive to sounds, textures, that kind of thing. That wasn't explicitly core before.
And the book stresses that getting a diagnosis isn't just about having some traits. It's very specific within these two domains, isn't it?
Exactly. It's quite stringent. An individual needs to meet all four criteria under social communication. Things like issues with back and forth conversation, nonverbal communication problems, difficulty with relationships.
All four. Wow.
And at least two of the four criteria under restricted repetitive behaviors. Plus, these issues have to trace back to early childhood, even if they only really become obvious when life's social demands get more complex.
But hang on, this is where the controversy comes in, right? The chapter points out that this DSM-5 definition, while maybe clearer, might actually be narrower. It could potentially exclude people diagnosed under DSM-IV.
That's a major point of discussion, yes. DSM-IV allowed for, well, thousands of combinations of symptoms to reach a diagnosis. DSM-5 cut that down to just 12 combinations.
12 from thousands.
Drastically fewer. And research highlighted in the text suggests this does create a narrower diagnostic window. The concern is particularly for individuals with higher cognitive abilities, or maybe younger kids who are more able. The text estimates that maybe 80% of those previously diagnosed with Asperger's or PDD-NOs might not meet the stricter DSM-5 criteria. That's a big potential gap in services.
Which is probably why they introduced those severity specifiers in DSM-5. To capture the range within the diagnosis. Can you walk us through those levels? What does level 3 support look like versus level 1?
Precisely. The specifiers describe the level of support needed. Level 3 is requiring very substantial support. We're talking severe deficits in social communication, very little initiation of social interaction, and extreme difficulty coping with change. Even small changes can cause great distress and really interfere with functioning across the board.
Okay, very substantial support.
Then you have level 1, requiring support. Here, individuals can usually speak in full sentences, but even with support, their social impairments are noticeable. They might try to engage, but that back-and-forth conversational flow often breaks down. Making friends is tough. And their inflexibility, while not as extreme as level 3, still causes significant problems in day-to-day life.
Right, so it captures that spectrum of need.
Yeah.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. The history here is really fascinating, starting with Leo Kanner back in 1943. What were those absolute core features he first identified?
Kanner's paper was foundational. He pinpointed two things he saw as innate. First, the autistic disturbances of affective contact, basically, an inborn difficulty connecting socially and emotionally. Second, that powerful insistence on sameness, major distress with changes in routine. He also noted other classic features like stereotype movements, unusual speech patterns, echolalia, where kids repeat what they hear, was a big one.
And then almost immediately, Hans Asperger described a different group. How did his observations contrast with Kanner's and sort of launch this whole spectrum idea?
Well, Asperger, just a year later, described boys he called autistischen Psychopathen. Like Kanner's group, they had significant social difficulties. But the key difference was their language. Often, their verbal abilities were quite good, sometimes even advanced for their age, though they still struggled with using language socially, the pragmatics.
Interesting.
They also had these incredibly intense, narrow interests and often showed motor clumsiness. So seeing this group socially impaired but verbally fluent really broadened the picture right from the start. It showed this wasn't just one thing.
Before we get to the modern theories, the chapter does mention those early psychosocial ideas that have since been completely debunked.
Yes, it's important to acknowledge that briefly. In the 50s and 60s, you had the damaging refrigerator mother theory, wrongly blaming autism on cold parenting. It led to a lot of misplaced guilt and ineffective treatments like psychotherapy for the parents. Science eventually showed definitively that autism is neurological, and structured teaching methods were far more helpful.
Thank goodness. Okay, fast forward to the 1990s. Research got more sophisticated, focusing on cognitive explanations, especially for higher functioning individuals. Three big ones stand out: theory of mind, weak central coherence, and executive dysfunction.
Right. These theories try to explain how thinking might be different. Theory of mind deficit suggests a core difficulty in understanding that other people have their own thoughts, beliefs, intentions, mental states separate from one's own.
So difficulty inferring what someone else is thinking.
Exactly. Makes understanding things like deception, sarcasm, or even simple misunderstandings incredibly hard. Then there's weak central coherence.
What's that about?
That theory proposes a reduced tendency to pull details together to see the big picture or grasp the overall context. This can manifest as a strength, like being amazing at spotting tiny details, like finding a hidden shape in a complex drawing, but a weakness in understanding the gist of a story or situation.
Okay, detail focus over global understanding. And the third one, executive dysfunction.
This links some ASD traits to problems with executive functions, the brain's management system. Things like difficulty shifting attention, inhibiting impulses, planning, organizing, thinking flexibly. These deficits look somewhat similar, functionally, to what you might see after damage to the frontal lobes.
So taken together, how do these cognitive theories help explain someone who maybe Kanner's initial description didn't quite fit? Say, someone very bright but socially struggling.
They help explain the mechanisms behind the social difficulties in verbally fluent individuals. Kanner saw the lack of connection. These theories suggest why that connection might fail. Maybe the person processes information differently, struggles to infer social meaning quickly, or gets stuck on details rather than social cues. They might know facts about social rules but can't apply them fluidly in real-time interactions.
That makes sense. Okay, connecting cognition to biology. Genetics clearly plays a massive role. What do the twin studies tell us?
The evidence is overwhelming. For identical twins monozygotic, if one has a strict autism diagnosis, the chance of the other having it is around 60%. That's very high.
60%.
But if you look at the broader autism phenotype, meaning traits that are autistic-like, but don't meet full criteria, that concordance rate in identical twins jumps way up to like 80 or even 90%. It strongly points to a major genetic influence.
And genetic research itself seems complex. It's not just one autism gene, is it? What are the main themes coming out of that research?
Definitely not one gene. It's
Yeah.
a very complex picture. Researchers are looking at a couple of things. One focus is on rare mutations. These could be changes in a single gene or larger changes called copy number variations, CNVs, where segments of DNA are deleted or duplicated. These rare events can have a big impact.
Okay, rare but high impact.
Then there's the role of common genetic variants. These are small variations that are common in the population. Individually, each one might only add a tiny bit of risk, but if someone inherits many of them, the combined effect, the polygenic risk, can become significant.
And are these different genes pointing in similar biological directions?
That's the really interesting part. Yes, even though hundreds of genes have been linked to ASD risk, they tend to cluster. They often involve similar biological pathways. We see genes involved in chromatin modification, that's basically how genes get turned on or off, and genes crucial for synaptic function, how neurons communicate.
Which might explain why ASD often overlaps with other conditions like epilepsy or intellectual disability.
Exactly. Many of these same genetic risk factors aren't specific just to ASD. They increase the risk for a range of neurodevelopmental conditions. And we also see specific genetic syndromes strongly associated, like Fragile X syndrome. About 20–30% of boys with Fragile X also meet criteria for ASD. And new discoveries, like mutations in the CHD8 gene, show a very high rate of ASD in affected individuals.
Okay, let's shift from the genes to the brain itself. Kanner noticed larger heads, megalocephaly. What has modern MRI shown us about brain structure and development in ASD?
Yeah, that early observation holds up. Structural MRI studies consistently find that, on average, total brain volume is about 6% larger in young children with ASD compared to typically developing kids. This includes both gray matter and white matter.
6% larger, noticeable early on.
Right, sometimes as early as age 2. And fascinating studies like the Infant Brain Imaging Study, or IBIS, have found differences even earlier. They saw subtle abnormalities in white matter connections at just 7 months in infants who later developed ASD. It suggests the brain's wiring develops differently from very early on, especially in pathways related to social function.
But the chapter mentions this overgrowth isn't permanent. It follows a specific trajectory.
That's a key point. It seems to be an early overgrowth. Brain size tends to normalize during childhood and adolescence. So it's not just about having a bigger brain overall, but about this atypical developmental trajectory growing too fast, too early, which might disrupt how brain networks get organized during critical periods for social and cognitive development.
And speaking of organization, there's a really critical finding from post-mortem studies about neural pruning. Can you explain what that is and what they found?
Yes, this is crucial. Neural pruning is a normal, essential process, mainly during adolescence, where the brain eliminates weak or unnecessary synaptic connections. It's like tidying up the wiring to make the important connections stronger and more efficient.
Okay, getting rid of clutter.
Exactly. Typical brains prune away maybe 40% of these connections, these dendritic spines. But a key postmortem study found that brains from individuals with ASD had only pruned about half that amount. They had an excess of these connections.
Wow, so less pruning. What's the mechanism behind that?
The study linked this pruning failure to overactivity of a protein called MTR. When MTR is too active, it seems to block the cell's natural cleanup process called autophagy.
Autophagy, like self-eating.
Sort of, yeah. It's how cells get rid of damaged or unnecessary components, including synapses. If autophagy is blocked by hyperactive MTOR, you end up with too many synapses, potentially leading to noisy or inefficient brain signaling. This excess connectivity might even relate to the higher rates of seizures seen in ASD.
Okay, that's structure and cellular mechanisms. What about the brain in action? What does functional MRI, fMRI, tell us about which areas are working differently?
fMRI studies show patterns of both underactivity and sometimes overactivity in key social brain regions. For example, the fusiform gyrus, which is really important for recognizing faces, often shows less activity in people with ASD when they're looking at faces. This mirrors the clinical difficulties some have with face recognition.
Makes sense. What else?
The amygdala and parts of the brain's reward circuitry also often show reduced activation in response to social stimuli. This might mean that social interactions are inherently less rewarding, neurologically speaking, for individuals with ASD.
Less reinforcing.
Potentially, yes. And areas like the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a hub for thinking about others' thoughts and intentions related to theory of mind, also show atypical function.
And we can actually see some of this reflected in how people look at faces, right? Tell us about the eye tracking findings.
Yeah, the eye tracking studies are really revealing. They often show that when viewing a face, especially someone talking, adults with high-functioning autism might focus much more on the mouth area and less on the eyes.
Focusing on the mouth.
Yes, whereas typical viewers spend much more time looking at the eyes, where a lot of the nonverbal emotional information is conveyed. Avoiding the eye region means missing out on a constant stream of subtle social cues. It visually demonstrates that difference in processing social information.
Let's bring this together with the case example from the textbook, John. How did his story illustrate these core features?
John's case is quite typical in many ways, though severe. Parental concern started around 18 months, classic timing. He wasn't developing language and was described as an undemanding baby, not seeking social interaction, not engaging in games like peekaboo.
The too good baby sometimes mentioned.
Right. He developed speech, but it was echolalic, repeating phrases without grasping their communicative use. He had that intense insistence on sameness, getting very distressed by changes in routine. His play was limited and repetitive, like focusing only on spinning the wheels of a toy car instead of pretend play.
And he had some of the associated features, too.
Yes, importantly, he developed seizures in adolescence, which fits with the neurobiological findings about connectivity and potential pruning issues. He also had sensory sensitivities, hyperreactivity to loud noises and certain textures. So his profile really encapsulates both core domains, the social communication deficits and the restricted repetitive behaviors and sensory issues.
Okay, so given that ASD is usually lifelong, what does the prognosis look like today? Has it improved since Kanner's time?
Definitely. While ASD is lifelong, outcomes are significantly better now, largely thanks to earlier diagnosis and effective interventions. The two biggest positive prognostic factors identified in the chapter are developing functional communicative speech by about age 5 and having a nonverbal IQ score above 70.
Speech by 5 and IQ over 70.
Those two factors strongly predict better long-term adaptation, independence, and quality of life because they allow better access to education and learning adaptive skills.
All right, let's talk treatment. The chapter makes it clear this is primarily about behavioral and educational approaches, not medication for the core symptoms. Why is that?
Because right now, there are no medications that reverse the core social communication deficits or the restricted repetitive behaviors of ASD. Medications are used, but they target associated symptoms like irritability or hyperactivity. The core interventions are behavioral and educational.
And what makes these interventions effective? There are different models, ABA, naturalistic approaches. Do they share common elements?
Yes, the evidence suggests effective interventions, regardless of the specific named model, share key ingredients. Timeliness and intensity are critical, starting early and providing substantial hours, often 15 or more per week, leads to better outcomes.
Early and intensive.
Absolutely. Also crucial is individualization. The goals have to be tailored to the specific child's strengths and weaknesses. Effective programs often use visual supports, incorporate the child's special interests to motivate learning, involve caregivers heavily, and focus on teaching functional, adaptive skills that improve daily living.
And what about those medications? What are they used for specifically?
They're mainly for managing challenging associated features. The antipsychotics, like risperidone, have the strongest evidence, primarily for reducing significant irritability, aggression, and self-injury.
Okay, for irritability and aggression.
SSRIs, the antidepressants, are sometimes used for repetitive behaviors or anxiety, but the evidence there is a bit more mixed compared to their use for irritability. And stimulants, commonly used for ADHD, might help with hyperactivity and inattention in some individuals with ASD, but side effects can sometimes be more problematic, so careful monitoring is needed.
Right, so meds are for associated symptoms, not the core ASD itself. Okay, let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot: the shift to 2 core domains in DSM-IV, the historical journey from Kanner to the spectrum concept, the complex genetics pointing to synaptic pathways, the atypical brain development with that crucial finding about failed pruning.
It's a really dynamic field, and the textbook suggests the future is definitely heading towards more personalized approaches, moving beyond just comparing groups ASD versus typical towards understanding the individual. That's where things like connectome-based predictive models, CPMs, come in.
CPMs, what are those?
These are sophisticated analytical techniques using brain imaging data, like fMRI connectivity patterns, to try and predict before treatment starts how an individual child might respond to a specific intervention, like pivotal response treatment mentioned in one study. It's about tailoring treatment based on individual brain profiles. Precision medicine, essentially.
Which leads us to a really interesting closing thought for you, our listeners. Given this move towards highly individualized neurobiological markers and precision medicine, what are the ethical considerations around potentially using advanced brain imaging to predict needs or tailor interventions for very young children, maybe even before they show the full symptoms of ASD? Something to think about.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world of autism spectrum disorders based on Kaplan and Sadock's comprehensive text.